This is a Texas Public Radio Dare to Listen event where we try to slow things down, have a civil conversation, get away from the talking points, and consider other points of view, hopefully come up with some mutual understandings. I'm David Martin Davies, the host of The Source on Texas Public Radio. The COVID-19 pandemic persists across Texas and the entire country. It is prompting local, state, and the federal government to respond in order to protect public health. But some are rejecting COVID response orders and mandates, and they cite their personal rights and freedoms. But in our system of laws and the framework that we have for governing, do those freedoms actually exist? How do we balance individual liberty against the public good, especially during a pandemic? And why does that matter? So let's introduce our panel. We're joined by Michelle Bratcher-Goodwin, JD, Chancellor's Professor and Founding Director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. And Michelle Bratcher-Goodwin, welcome to The Source. Welcome to our Dare.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Also with us, Randall Urban, Adjunct Professor at the University of Texas School of Law, former Legislative Director for Texas Governor Greg Abbott. And Randy Urban, welcome to Dare to Listen.
Thanks for having me, David.
And we're also joined by Angela Morrison, Associate Professor at Texas A&M University School of Law. Angela Morrison, it's good to have you.
Thanks, I'm delighted to be here.
So let's start off by talking about individual rights, individual freedoms. We know that is a big part of what makes America great, but are there limits? Is it an absolute right and liberty that people have, especially when there is a pandemic? And Michelle Bratcher-Goodwin, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's a great question. It's great to be with you. And it's important to know that there are no absolute constitutional rights. The Constitution protects our civil liberties and our civil rights from being infringed by government. And that's critically important. We see that with the Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution establishes our rights against government tyranny. And yet there are instances where government can protect its citizenry. And in those cases, quite explicitly, with regard to protecting the public's health, government has been able to mitigate, I suppose, or to infringe, others would say, on those rights. Some of the earliest cases in U.S. jurisprudence have involved that. In 1905, Jacobson v. Massachusetts, the United States Supreme Court took up a case that involved a mandatory vaccination law, and the Supreme Court upheld it. 1922, the issue was revisited by the Supreme Court. And again, in that instance involving compulsory vaccination in order to attend schools, the Supreme Court upheld that ruling as well. We've lived under a long history in the United States with vaccination being an issue that, for the most part, people have agreed on. There have been movements, and the movement that we see today is quite different than the movements we've seen in the past, where there have been parents who've expressed vaccine hesitancy. And many of the parents who've traditionally expressed vaccine hesitancy are people who come from high-income neighborhoods. Many of them might consider themselves progressive Democrats even. Today, what we see is something that's very different in terms of the pushback that is occurring against vaccination. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And I would add one other piece here that actually goes back centuries. The idea of protecting the public's health from illness and the spread of disease actually goes back millennia. We know and can trace it back centuries. We can trace it back centuries to quarantine laws. And in fact, when we think about some of the earliest expressions of law being upheld in the United States, before we even have a Supreme Court as we have constituted today, were in fact the upholding of regulations that addressed being able to quarantine off individuals to prevent the spread of communicable diseases that could cause the deaths of individuals.
Randy Urban, your former legislative director for Texas Governor Greg Abbott. We can make that argument and tell people, here's the Constitution, here's the case law. Doesn't seem like many people are going to respond to that very well at some of these ISD board meetings where they're going on and on about my rights and my kid and my concerns. This is a communication problem as well. How do we have that conversation?
Well, I think this is the most difficult public policy issue I've seen, at least since the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And there's two reasons for it. First is that there were no template or playbook for the pandemic. As catastrophic as a hurricane is, governors and mayors and county judges know how to deal with hurricanes. They get the people out, they harden the infrastructure, and then they send the crews in and make the repairs and restore electricity and vital services. Here, we had absolutely no template. We had no guide for how to deal with it. And I think that confused people because you saw varied orders from local jurisdictions, school districts, the governor, and relying on various health authorities that are and health experts from across the board. And there was no single source that you could go to address the pandemic. And the evidence of this is that in his first 5 years as governor, Governor Abbott issued 7 executive orders, including dealing with Hurricane Harvey, which is one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the state. And since the pandemic, he's issued 32 executive orders and over the past 18 months. And they've varied. They've varied for everything from a mask mandate back in July of 2020 to a mask prohibition that he issued last month. And so I think that there's some confusion about what's really the best course in a lot of instances. The second problem with the pandemic, and makes it such a difficult issue, is that every action a government takes to address health and safety has an almost equal and negative effect on the economy. If you try to close a business, I mean, obviously that's going to hurt the economy. It's going to hurt local business owners. It's going to impact employees. And then every step you take to reopen the economy is met with an increase in infections almost. And so I think that part of the problem is that there have been so many confusing orders, both on the state and the local level, and sometimes they conflict. And you've obviously seen the governor try to enforce, state orders over local orders, and some of the local jurisdictions are in vehement disagreement with those and are issuing their own mask orders. So I think that part of the problem we have is that it's just such a new thing for everybody, and it's been very, very confusing.
Angela Morrison at Texas A&M University School of Law. It seems like there are competing ideas about how we're going to live together in this government with this framework. One of them is about our constitutional rights. The other one is about state police powers. And then there's the issue of federalism. Juggling all three of these simultaneously in order to survive a pandemic, things get messy, things get dropped. But what should be our top concern?
And I think that as we think about this going forward, is that we want to do things that will balance, right, the public interest in being safe and protected during the pandemic versus maybe what the economic impact might be. And so, for example, one of the areas of law in which I study is workplace law. And employers are in a particular bind when it comes to balancing individual rights versus the health and safety of all of their workers in the workplace. And so at the policy level or the government level, there are government actors that need to be making decisions that are going to protect the public health. And then, of course, private businesses and private employers that also need to be concerned about what can they do under federal laws or under state laws. And I think also, even outside of what the legal requirements or what may be allowed legally, is what ethically or how they might want to best treat their employees. They need to consider that as well. And one other thing to add to that, as we think about some of the news coming out where even now there are employers that are afraid to require vaccination because they're concerned about losing employees in a really tight labor market.
Some great points. We'll get into those. I'm going to swing back to Michelle Bretcher Goodwin and take up on some of the points that Randy Urban brought to us about no playbook. Like, we've never been through this before. I think it was in 2012 that we had Ebola here in Texas.
Yeah, that's right. 2014, 15. So it's actually not the case that we actually haven't had the mass spread of disease or illness. We've seen outbreaks here in California at Disney World. We've seen outbreaks, and in our country within the last decade, we've had
We had
Ebola,
H1N1.
H1N1, Zika.
With Ebola, we saw New Jersey Governor Chris Christie quarantine an individual, a nurse from Maine who just got back from Africa treating patients with Ebola.
That's right. That was actually in Maine. And it raises some very interesting questions. So there are 2 points that I think that are important to make with that, which is that government preparedness and making sure that it's seamless, because we did actually have those incidents take place. Those were global pandemics. Everyone was concerned about Ebola. H1N1 as well, which manifested in the United States and spread around the world. But there wasn't the political divisiveness around it. There was swift action. What is it that we need to do? There wasn't resistance taking place on the part of the president, who at the time was Barack Obama, a Congress that was cooperative in addressing those public health issues, a CDC that didn't have to worry about the political winds in terms of addressing those particular issues. And that meant that there could be swift and somewhat seamless coordination such that it would be easy for Americans to even forget that there was Ebola and there was Zika and there was H1N1, because there was that level of collaboration and cooperation from the federal government to the state and local government addressing those particular issues. And that's important. On the civil liberties front, that also raises a very important issue, because the nurse who came back from treating patients on the west coast of Africa actually did not have Ebola herself, had tested negative for that. And the governor of Maine still wanted to quarantine her. And that is where you say that government should not exceed its authority. It would have met a standard had she Ebola, and we know how infectious that is, and quarantine her so that nobody else could possibly get Ebola. But she didn't have it. And so that is an example of where government exceeds authority, quarantining someone who doesn't have a virus or a disease and keeping them from being able to do what otherwise they should be able to do.
So Randy Urban, is the lesson that we're learning right now is that we're basically becoming an ungovernable country. People were refusing to admit that their civil liberties have some limits and in a pandemic, and that the common good is not as important as their refusal to wear a mask or get a safe, effective vaccine.
Well, I think Michelle makes a good point that we have a lot of political divisiveness now. But I still think that Americans want to, and Texans want everybody to be healthy, and I think that everybody wants to get out of this pandemic as fast as possible. And I think what's happened is that politics has been overlaid over it. I don't think there's any question that some of the governor's executive orders of recent vintage, which prohibit masking, prohibit some vaccine passports, are viewed in the context of a Republican primary challenge he's going to face in 2022. He's already got 2 people announced against him that are, very conservative and very critical of his actions in the pandemic to, limit the opening of businesses and, requiring masking as he did in 2020. So I think, everybody has got to understand that there's a political overlay on both sides And that's what makes it so difficult. And, you know, the governor is a weak governor in Texas, except when there's a disaster. And the legislature is giving the governor broad powers, extraordinarily broad powers. And they like it that way, because I think there's a couple of things when you talk about the politics of it. The legislature likes to pass the buck to the governor and make him be responsible, because there's criticism from both the right and the left for any action that he takes. And evidence of this fact is that during the 2021 legislative session, the legislature, even though they were complaining a lot about what the governor was doing, did not terminate the state of disaster as it has a right to do, or pass legislation curbing gubernatorial authority. And so I think you have this political overlay during a very difficult pandemic, which, you know, and I think the distinction that I would make between this pandemic and the prior ones is just so much broader. We didn't lose 600,000 people to Ebola or H1N1. I mean, this was, and everybody got it. And I mean, you know, all ages got it, and all socioeconomic categories got it. And I just think that when you have such a broad pandemic and you have the political overlay of it, I just think it makes it extraordinarily difficult to get everybody on the same page.
So this is a community conversation. We do want to hear from the people watching live. And if you want, you can type in your questions or comments in the comment thread below, and we'll get those to our panelists. Angela Morrison, as we talk about workplace law, how is it that an employer can say, if you're going to work for me, you have to get a vaccine? Does that right exist for an employer?
Yes, it does in general. I mean, one of the basic tenets of American workplace law is that employment is generally at will, including here in Texas, which means that an employer can fire you for really any reason or not hire you for any reason, unless it's limited by some other sort of law, by a state statute or a federal statute. And of course, there's some statutes that might implicate vaccinations or might implicate mask wearing. So statutes such as the American with Disabilities Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act that prohibits discrimination on the basis of, among other things, religion or pregnancy. And so all of those have been concerns with employers that they want to make sure when they pass the vaccine mandates that they don't violate those specific laws. But even still with those laws, the EEOC has issued guidance that has said in most circumstances, employers can require a vaccination or requiring masking in the workplace.
So Michelle Bratcher-Goodwin, we're hearing also in these volatile school board meetings, people talking about their parental rights. And I don't co-parent with the government. You can't tell me what to do with my child. I don't want my child to wear a mask because she feels uncomfortable with the mask, and everyone should be able to see my child's beautiful face. And I don't blame people for wanting that to happen, but is that an actual right? What are the parental rights here?
So these are really good questions, because typically there's deference to parents in parenting their children. Of course, there is deciding what meals will be served at home, what clothes that one wants his or her children to wear, whether the household is going to be vegan or not. But the truth of the matter is, when it comes to public health and safety, the government has long been able to issue standards for children that will enter its schools. It was a case in 1922, nearly a century ago, where the Supreme Court upheld legislation requiring that children who attend schools be vaccinated. Now, over time, there have been some states that have allowed for some exemptions. Some of those exemptions there basically been two categories: religious exemptions, because there are some religious communities that are opposed to vaccination, just like there's religious community, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who are opposed to blood transfusion. And then the other exemption has been for health. In very, very, very rare cases, there may be allergic reactions to vaccination. And so states have allowed for exemption, some states, not all states, in those categories. But there have been beyond vaccination, which has been very, very clear that a state can require kids to be vaccinated before attending schools. But there are other rules that schools regularly have, that children may not bring weapons to school. Some have policies with regard to how children are kempt and clean before coming to school. We know that there are mandatory reporting policies such that if a teacher spots a child who looks like that child may be harmed at home, where there may be some form of negligence, etc., that schools are required to report those parents to authorities. So this idea that parents can, without any kind of limitations, restrictions whatsoever, engage with the public and their children in any kind of way possible is actually just not true. There are protocols that have been put in place in every state, from child abuse and protection laws to laws that involve vaccination and so many more. So for parents who are showing up at school board meetings that are claiming that they have unfettered rights vis-a-vis their children, we know absolutely that is not true. Parents may not do just anything that they want to do with their children. Protecting their children's health and safety has been an issue that government has taken up too.
And Randy Urban, this right to earn a living, right to have a small business. And then we have a pandemic. Fortunately, we're not talking about shutdowns anymore, but we did have them, and hopefully we will not have them again. But should a small business owner, do they have a right to be made whole by the government?
Well, we had an example of that in North Texas early in the pandemic. There was a woman named Shelley Luther who had a hair salon. And one of the governor's early executive orders prohibited hair salons and barbershops and other types of personal hygiene businesses from being open during the earliest phase of the pandemic. And she didn't like that, and she opened up her hair salon and started serving customers. She was served with process and taken to court. And when she didn't pay the fine, she was actually put in jail for a little while by a judge. And she continued to complain, and she became kind of a cause celeb from the controversy. And in fact, soon after that, Governor Abbott removed confinement in jail as a penalty for violating an executive order. She actually went and ran for the state Senate after that. She didn't win, but she became very popular. And I think what she did was kind of give voice to a lot of people who obviously disagreed with some of these limits. And they, what they did is they put their economic well-being ahead of the potential the public health harm. And that just kind of goes to underscore the differences between some on the right and some on the left. The right's always going to err toward the side of keeping the economy going and keeping small businesses vibrant. And some on the left obviously think that the public health protections are more important. So that's an excellent question, and I just don't know how you really answered. I think some of the CARES Act funding is going to ameliorate some of it, but it's still not going to feed the bulldog for a lot of small businesses that closed during the pandemic.
At that Shelley Luther hair salon, I think Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick went there to have his head coiffed, and other Republican leaders and elected leaders in Texas. And it seemed like the state of Texas was speaking with two voices, two mouths on this issue. We have to shut down businesses, hair salons. You can see why that would be not a good idea to have these things open during the pandemic with the virus that is spread. But then it becomes political, and that goes out the window. So Randy, what do we make of that?
Well, it's a very good question. I think the legislature tried to address some of it during the most recent legislative session. I think we're still having arguments, between state and the state government and the local governments. I mean, I haven't seen this level of disagreement, and and I hate to use the word defiance, but I mean, you have 50 school districts in at least 8 counties and cities that are issuing mask mandates that are in violation of the governor's executive order, and they are willing to go to court and spend their money to defend what they believe is their right to protect their students or their constituents. And so it's a very thorny issue, and I don't think it gets resolved anytime soon.
Angela Morrison, associate professor at Texas A&M University School of Law, you deal with workplace law quite a bit. There's been a lot of concern about the rights of businesses not to be sued by employees who may actually be infected with COVID while on the job. That became a right for businesses to be protected from that litigation. That became very popular in Austin with the Republican Party. What does that tell us?
I mean, I think one is it's just going to some of the concerns that Randy discussed, which people are concerned about employers' economic well-being, which is, again, nothing new in American law. A lot of times employers' economic well-being is prioritized sometimes, right, over workers' rights, and we find that in various court decisions. So, and as you mentioned, in Texas did pass legislation that's going to make it harder for workers to bring torts against employers for COVID infections. It will be interesting to see what happens with some of the Southwest employees, right, who have current litigation pending against Southwest Airlines based on being exposed to the virus. But there's also other laws under which employees, as we know, have tried to bring lawsuits against employers for being exposed to COVID or COVID-related decisions. So there's a spate of age discrimination lawsuits that have been brought in various jurisdictions in New York in particular, for employees who are now saying that their employers have failed to hire them back after COVID layoffs based on their age. There are other avenues of relief for people who may have been exposed to COVID in the workplace. In addition to tort law, there are employees who have disabilities who might be able to get relief under the Americans with Disability Act to get a reasonable accommodation from their employer so they're not exposed to COVID in the workplace. The OSH Act, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, provides some protections to workers if there's an imminent danger that's posed. And the OSHA administration just issued new guidelines, enforcement guidelines, where they're going to prioritize certain investigations into certain workplaces related to COVID, health settings, looking at whether employers are provided their employees personal protective gear, situations where employees are working in close quarters, like
right. So that brings up like these meat packing plants or these poultry plants where you have a lot of people working in an environment, they're cheek to jowl, just cutting up this meat. I've heard stories that these workers have been issued one face mask, and that's it. And they were told they had to work. If they didn't show up, they would lose their job. And so people were showing up, and then you would see these big blooms of infections of these places. And you could make a very good argument that the employer had complete disregard for the health and safety of those employees and put them in harm's way. And now those employees, they're going to have a much harder time trying to go into the courtroom and rectify that.
Definitely, if they're trying to bring a tort claim, right, in Texas, there might be different remedy, right, from OSHA, which has different sort of enforcement litigation and has now said that it's going to step up its enforcement efforts as compared to maybe under the prior administration. But you're right, there's really limited avenues for relief. One thing that I've seen that in particular meatpacking employees or employees in sort of dangerous industries are starting to show more interest in unionization, because they're hopeful that unions are going to negotiate and provide more protections for them. So I think that's another trend or a way that our employees are trying to get more protection than they otherwise might experience. Yes.
So, yeah, Michelle Bretcher Goodwin, what about employers should they be worried about being sued by patrons?
Well, they should, and that's a great question that you bring up, and so here something that I think is important to surface, which is that it's important in times of crisis, health crisis, that we do protect civil liberties and we do protect civil rights. And so when government is seeking to impose limitations on those rights, the government's action shouldn't be overly broad. They shouldn't be vague. They need to be related to exactly what the crisis is at the time. So the government can't say, well, there is the spread of COVID, and that means that we don't have a need for warrants to search your home. That is not related to COVID whatsoever, right? So there needs to be a tailoring. And so I want to emphasize that, because even while we talk about government having wide authority during these times to address COVID, it doesn't mean that the government can just do anything that it wants vis-a-vis people. Now to your really important question, which is with consumers. So while on one hand we can think about the employer-employee relationship, across the country, those who own restaurants and manage restaurants and grocery stores and whatnot have to be concerned about people who are their consumers, who are their customers, and making sure that they are safe from being harmed when they come into their establishment. There is a long history of civil case law, of tort law, of people being able to recover against food stores when they have encountered something that the food store should have known was a threat to their safety. For example, if there's a spill on aisle 9, the customer doesn't know about it, but employees do. The customer goes down aisle 9, slips and falls, breaks an arm, breaks a leg. The store is responsible for that. I mean, that's the kind of basic tort law. So can you imagine in a space of COVID, a pandemic? We know it's life-threatening. We know that people die. If you have a restaurant where you know there are people who are not vaccinated, with the possibility of that vaccine, of COVID spreading, and you invite customers in, and your customers become sick or possibly even die, well, those restaurant owners should be preparing themselves then for litigation that would come from the people who became sick, or if they died, from their loved ones.
So Michelle Bretcher Goodwin, in this time of COVID and these arguments that we're having, we're no longer having thought puzzles, thought experiments. This is happening in real time, in real life. It seems like there is a reordering of the hierarchy of rights that we have in our society. For example, with the Supreme Court, they have ruled that keeping churches open is more important than trying to slow the spread of the virus. That the highest right that they want to protect is religious freedom. And I do wonder, when we talk about our rights that we have, it's frequently that it can be a zero-sum gain, because when I gain rights, sometimes it's at the expense of others. Is that happening now? And who's the winners and who are the losers?
That's such a great question as well. So Justice Elena Kagan, before the pandemic, issued a cause of concern. And she said that she was concerned that the First Amendment was being weaponized. And by that, I think that what she might have meant was the fact that there could be some who think that because of their religion, that they could use religion as a sword. And the truth of it is that is not what the First Amendment provides for. The First Amendment provides for an individual's religious freedom to be protected, their expression of their religion, which means that in the United States, if you want to be Catholic, you can be Catholic. If you are Jewish, you can be Jewish without persecution from the state. If you are Jehovah's Witness, the state has no authority to infringe on your ability to claim that as your religion. That is what the First Amendment speaks to government not harming, persecuting an individual or a group because of their religious identity. Having a religious identity does not provide one the right or the authority to infringe on others' rights, nor does it provide the opportunity for one to harm another person because one has a religious identity. There is no history of jurisprudence in the United States since the history and founding of our Supreme Court that has ever articulated that a religious right trumps all other rights in our Constitution. That has never been uttered. It is not part of the precedent in our jurisprudence. And even for those who would identify themselves as originalists or as textualists, you will not find originalist thinking from the court or textualist thinking that supports that point of view. Now, that said, I think what you point out is something that is a glaring concern today, which is perhaps the thinking of some people that by claiming a religious right, that would mean that they could infringe upon the rights of other people. And we see that playing out in some ways in real time in the United States.
Randy Urban, is there a requirement that the government use the least restrictive measures in order to protect public health?
In Texas, the Disaster Act gives the governor authority to suspend statutes and regulations in order to cope with the disaster and issue executive orders that have the force and effect of state law. And there's no limitation on it. In fact, the Supreme Court, in almost every instant, it's been challenged. The Texas Supreme Court, both from the right, with some conservative activists complaining about mask mandates and in the extension of election hours that were enacted by executive order during the pandemic, and also from the left, complaining about prohibitions on restaurant curfews and limitations of restaurant hours. And the Texas Supreme Court has said almost without limitation that the governor's disaster authority is darn near absolute. And I'm guessing that there would be a instance to where they would change that opinion, but we haven't seen it to date. And even in the context of these recent lawsuits in Dallas and San Antonio trying to overturn the governor's mask prohibition, Supreme Court actually stayed the lower court order, which blocked the enforcement of the executive order. So they have the Supreme Court has consistently sided with the governor. And as I said before, the legislature has not tried to rein him in. And not that, not that they would maybe disagree or agree with everything that he did, but there has been precious little debate on the governor's powers during the disaster. And the reason that the governor has these powers is, we have a part-time legislature. They wanted the state to be able to act with agility and speed to react to a disaster, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, or a pandemic. And so they gave the governor these broad powers because the legislature is too cumbersome to act that quickly and that with that agility. So anyway, to date, there has been no judicial limitation on this power, and there's been no legislative limitation on this power.
But we have seen almost a loop-de-loop, flip the script on how the governor can use those powers. It's been compared to as if a hurricane is about to hit Houston, and the governor puts out an order saying he's going to ban mandatory evacuations, and he's going to ban curfews or lockdowns, things that we have during these natural disasters. Typically, you would think that's crazy. No governor would ever do that. But now we live in a world where we have a governor who has a prohibition on mandatory masks and also on vaccines. And we know these are things that will slow the spread, prevent the spread of the disease, keep people from dying. And yet here he is prohibiting the mandatory use of these actions. So that's where we're seeing this argument. And so far, it seems to have legs in the courts that San Antonio, Bexar County, other city ISDs are saying the governor is using his power in order to prevent us from actually being able to deal with this disaster.
David, if I can, this
Yeah.
is Michelle. What I would like to offer there is that you point out something, and Randy is speaking to something too, about the partisan ways in which we see these matters being handled in these times. And that is what's unfortunate. If you actually look back over the history of our court and also government, there's been general consensus about leaning into science and public health. There have been times in which government has tried to exceed its authority and has, but generally, if I talked about the 1922 case and also Jacobson v. Massachusetts, these were not split decisions, right? These were not 5-4 decisions. We're talking about decisions on the court that were 7-2, that were that were bipartisan, if you will. Typically, we don't use that terminology with regard to the Supreme Court because we consider our justices to be, of course, nonpartisan. But what we do see today, and it's unfortunate, are the winds of politics entering this space, both in terms of our courts and also in terms of the political process as we address these public health matters. And that's incredibly dangerous. I wish that weren't the case. And the reason why I wanted to underscore that is that I think that there is something to be said about there being certain areas that are sacred for bipartisan communication and for bipartisan governing within this country. And it's sad, and it disturbs the public when we lose that to political rhetoric.
I have a question. Okay, go ahead.
Well, the only
Randy.
thing I'd say, the argument back is that the governor's tasked with the governance of the entire state, including ensuring economic vitality and achieving a balance between these health measures and economic growth, because the flow of tax revenue is what pays for everything. So any orders that limit these preventative measures, they're going to argue that he is trying to keep the economy going. And we'll see what the courts say about that as we move into further litigation on these issues.
I have a question from a viewer, and it says, I have young children and our household is currently under quarantine, initially due to a close contact notification from school. I'm concerned and honestly exasperated that schools are hesitant to require masks at all. Can you speak about the rights of schools to require masks, perhaps via dress code requirements or something similar? And I guess, Michelle, we saw Paris ISD adopt this as a dress code item, and people have seen that as a loophole. But I don't know how long that's going to work.
Schools can require any number of things. Schools can require that to eat the lunch you have to pay. Schools have dress code requirements. So the idea that during a pandemic, where we know just in the first 2 months of this pandemic, we lost more people died in the first 2 or 3 months in the United States of COVID than in 19 years of the Vietnam War, to put that in context. And so to the listener, the viewer's question, yes, schools have long imposed any number of requirements that students have had to follow in order to attend those schools. Absolutely. So mask requirements, sure.
Right.
What schools cannot do is impose requirements that would otherwise infringe on the civil liberties of children that do not relate to their attendance of school.
So my question about that is, the state, the power of the state, school districts, they get their gubernatorial, their power to govern and have control over students from the state. The
That's right.
federal government, we are the United States of America. It all comes from our
Absolutely.
states. So if the governor says, I don't want those kids to wear a mask, he seems like he's got a lot of power.
All right, so you're now pointing out an important federalism question that brings us, in some ways, back to Brown v. Board of Education, right? Or the images that we've seen over time of people integrating school buses, or a little girl in Louisiana walking up the steps of an elementary school with troopers behind her. So state authority is also not absolute. Now, a state's authority, a governor's authority, is going to trump that of a school district. What you've seen very recently is the Department of Education from the federal government has now said, we will protect the interest of school boards that are looking to buck what the orders that have been put in place by governors are. So if this becomes a matter of federal versus state, the federal law always trumps that of state law. The 10th Amendment gives states the ability to legislate on matters that have not been legislated by the federal government. So it may very well be that the next point of contestation may be the federal government weighing in.
And Angela Morrison, I'm sorry, I haven't heard from you in a couple of minutes, Texas A&M School of Law. How is this impacting the workplace? You know, with the governor, he's saying no vaccine passports allowed in workplaces. As a matter of fact, a new law goes into effect on September 1st that was passed by the legislature and signed by Governor Greg Abbott, that not only we had the executive order and now we have an actual law. So it seems like the workplace is going to be very difficult to have a vaccinated place.
Yeah, so I would say there's really, I have three answers to that question. And so the first is, as far as the governor's order goes, it applies as to employers, to employees of state agencies or state government, right? So private employers can still require their employees to get vaccinated or to wear masks. The governor's order, though, and SB 968, which you just referenced, prohibit vaccine passports that apply to consumers. So under both the governor's order and under SB 968, businesses can't require vaccines as a condition of entering their business or shopping at their business. Some people have questioned the enforceability of some of SB 968, and the governor's order. Really, at this point, it looks like entities that maybe have a liquor license or other kinds of licenses from the state are the ones that could be harmed, right? If they end up requiring vaccinations from customers or consumers. Businesses that get other kind of funding, contracts from the state government, could be at risk, right? If they they require vaccinations or proof of having recovered from COVID, right, to enter a business. But as far as private employers requiring vaccines or masks, that's not prohibited for them to require of their employees. I also am just sort of interested, when I went back and reread the language in the executive orders, there's language that limits it to COVID-19 vaccines administered under an emergency use authorization.
Right,
so
but Governor Abbott is coming out this evening.
Yeah.
Saying, forget about it. I mean,
never mind, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, as far as the impact there, right?
Yeah, he's still anti-vaccine.
Now, yeah. Okay, well, great. But as far as employers and employees, private employers and employees, they can still require vaccines or masks. And I said three issues, sorry. The third issue is, as an employer, you would be concerned if you can't require vaccines or proof of vaccination or masks of customers, that could put your employees at risk. So again, employers, even private employers, can still have concern, I think, about the governor's executive orders, even though it only applies to customers or consumers.
So we are out of time, but it does seem like the world that we're living in is where we know that these individual rights are curbed. They're not absolute, but we here in Texas, in Florida, maybe a few other states, we have a governor who is going to curb those rights of the government to keep the public safe and allow people to continue to believe that they have these absolute rights. And the question is, what happens next time? There's going to be other pandemics, and they could be worse than this, and whether or not we're setting us up for tremendous fail when that comes our way. I do want to thank all of our panelists, Michelle Bratcher-Goodwin, JD at the Chancellor's Professor and Founding Director of the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at the University of California, Irvine School of Law, Randy Urban, Adjunct Professor at the University of Texas School of Law, former Legislative Director for the Texas Governor Greg Abbott, and Angela Morrison, Associate Professor at Texas A&M University School of Law. This has been a Dare to Listen, Know Your Rights in a Pandemic. I'm David Martin Davies. Thanks for listening.